Are you interested in a career in cybersecurity? Are you currently in law enforcement and looking to learn more about technology and cybersecurity? If so, please consider joining us for our master's degree in cybercrime and digital investigation from Michigan State University. Experience a nationally ranked program taught by world-renowned researchers like my two co-hosts on this show and practitioners that can help you play a role in combating cybercrime and advancing justice for victims. This is designed to be completed in as little as 2 years and in a flexible online format that works with your schedule. Visit cj.msu.edu to learn more. We hope you can join us. Welcome, everybody, to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. My name is Tom Holt. I'm a professor here in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, and I'm also the director for the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training. And I'm here with my two wonderful co-hosts, as always. Rachel, take it away.
I'm Dr. Rachel McNealey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice and an associate with the Cyber Center.
Hello, I'm Dr. Taylor Fisher. I am an assistant professor here at Michigan State University, and I am also an associate with the center.
And for today's guest, we have a very special person with us today. He is one of the new faculty here in our School of Criminal Justice. It's Dr. Cooper Maher. He's an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice. Cooper, thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So how did you get interested in criminal justice? How did you wind up with a career in CJ?
Oh, that's a good question. I was coming up on my last couple of years when I was in the Army. It was around 2014 when I got out, and I just really wasn't sure what to do. And I realized that after signing up for some general electives and right after getting out of the Army, the courses that I happened to really like the most and I felt the most drawn to were always the criminal justice courses. It felt like just a natural path for me to just declare that as my major and pursue it. And once I graduated, I realized, well, I don't know if I necessarily want to go in law enforcement. I don't know if I really want to be a practitioner in this space right now. I feel like I want to just stay in this academic space. So I continued with a master's and figured after a couple more years for a master's, I'd have my answer for what I wanted to do next. And PhD was what I wanted to do after that. So that was what I kept doing, and here I am.
Yes. So why cybercrime? What got you interested in that space?
That's a great question. I didn't really have much of an interest in cybercrime until I started my PhD program at the University of Cincinnati. When I was there, I really started to take an interest in the research on identity theft. It was one of the big topics that there was a lot of new data on at the time, and a lot of data that was just really interesting to me. And it was just sort of this crime type that was just really, there were a lot of different layers to it that I just found fascinating, and understanding what would put people at risk for this type of behavior. What sort of consequences did this type of victimization have beyond the financial? Because I know that it's easy for us to look at identity theft and just think, oh, it's a financial crime, one type of thing that you deal with, cancel your cards, case closed. But once I started getting a chance to really poke around the data and start doing some research, I saw that there was a lot more to it in terms of emotional consequences and physical and physiological consequences. So that was really what kept me in that space.
Something about identity theft that we've discussed a lot because we work together is kind of the reliance and presence of third parties as a response for identity theft, right? If your identity is stolen, sometimes your bank will have protections in place or they have some kind of response. And so I think that makes it a really unique form of crime, and that there's this really large crime response presence, but it's in the private sector, not the public.
That is a really interesting point, and I think that sort of as a side effect of the way that our response to identity theft and other sort of analogous crimes manifests is in these private sector, in these financial sectors, right? Banks have their own response to identity theft, fraud. It sometimes can sort of put the onus on the victim to act in a way that might be a bit unique relative to other types of crime response, right? There's often this responsibility, if this happened to you, you better act, you better cancel your cards, you better do this, you better do that. Otherwise, you might not be able to get the same level or type of reimbursement as if you pursue a different type of action, right? So I think that's really another aspect of it that really stands out to me as what makes this type of crime unique and really interesting to study.
I'm interested too in when we talk about identity theft, and your timeline is similar to mine in that going through college in like the early 2010s and stuff, you as well first. We kind of came up with technology and we entered into college with phones and computers. And so I don't know about you guys, but I remember getting those attacks really early on in life and not really knowing what it was, right? I'd get a smishing text and be like, what in the world is going on here? Like, I don't have a package coming, And so I think it's really interesting that we all kind of landed in this space of technology and cybercrime, given how we came up with it, and then really recognizing the need for something like a criminological response, right? We recognize that law enforcement only has certain resources that, we know the third party responses are more robust, maybe we'll say. But I think we've all kind of hit home on this idea that there needs to be more resources for the individuals, for the civilians, the people that don't have it. And I think your research has really touched on how many different ways we can be impacted. And so I'm interested in, what are some of the ways you've seen tech evolve within your research, and how do you kind of take that into account?
That's a great point. I think one of the things that I want to touch on first too is this idea that you mentioned of like the ubiquity of these attacks, right? Identity theft is one of the most common forms of victimization more generally, right? About 10% of Americans experience identity theft in some form per year. That's huge. It's millions of people. And I think that because you mentioned we all get these phishing attacks, we all get these text messages, right? We all get these so regularly that I don't know if y'all, but I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I tend to almost view these as sort of like the cost of business of our tech-centric environment right now. You get these messages. It's just part of the way of life. You can't necessarily avoid it. So we all just sort of think of like, okay, just ignore this one. Just ignore this message. This is obviously not Amazon saying I have a package coming, right? This is obviously some sort of phishing attack as part of a larger attempt to steal my identity or perpetrate some form of fraud. So I think that one of the really cool things that I've seen over the last couple of years is I've been paying a little bit closer attention, right? As I do more research in this space, I've been obviously paying more attention to my own life and sort of seeing how these things manifest. Seeing the responses, not just in terms of technological changes to sort of filter out and identify these messages as potentially fraudulent as they come in. That's been a huge innovation, but I've also been seeing a lot of offline shifts in responses as well, right? And this relates more to fraud more generally than identity theft, but every time I go out grocery shopping, right, I always like to look at the gift card rack right by the checkouts, not because I'm necessarily looking for gift cards, but I always like to see if they have a warning that says something to the effect of, gift cards are used to perpetrate fraud. Make sure that you're buying these for a legitimate purpose. Make sure you know why. And I think seeing that greater acknowledgement across society in these different areas, different spaces, it's exactly what we need, because this type of crime it's huge, and I don't think it's necessarily going away anytime soon, unfortunately.
That's super interesting, because I've had a similar thought along the lines of Bitcoin ATMs and how where they are should provide some sort of guardianship, right? The videos I've seen are law enforcement showing up to a gas station and there's an elderly woman trying to put her life savings into Bitcoin. And so it's really interesting that you say that about gift cards, because I never considered that. But there certainly is this level of what you were saying, the third party response, or maybe even responsibility to say, hey, I have this resource under my control. I need to make sure it's being used legitimately.
Similarly, I think it's reflected in the way that we talk about crime as a concept still, right? When we talk about crime politically, culturally, most people are talking about offline forms of crime or violent forms of crime. But things like identity theft are the most likely thing that you are to experience. And I think identity theft in particular suffers from kind of the white collar crime distinction, where when we talk about, cities getting safer, which is true, and crime is lowering, which is true, we're omitting a whole part of the conversation about how people are actually getting victimized. And I think that's really staggering, especially when you compare the amount of attention being paid to both in scholarship and the public sector.
Right. Crime, if we only think about street crime, violent crime, the traditional things that we think about in TV shows, right? Those are certainly going down. But if we're talking about crime more generally, trying to get this big picture of crime, I think it's a bit inappropriate to rule out fraud. I think if we're talking about identity fraud as falling under this umbrella of fraud more generally, something like 40% of all crime is fraud. And yes, street crime, violent crime, homicide, rape, robbery, arson, all these things are going down. That's great news, but is it necessarily a true picture of crime writ large? I don't know if I buy it, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really interesting too, because I think about if somebody attempted to rob me, I'd report it to the police, yes. Right? If somebody attempted to murder me, attempted to do any kind of street crime, I'm going to report it. But if somebody attempts to steal my identity through a smishing, I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to delete it. I'm not going to tell the police. And so that kind of informal response and how we manage it really depends on how well we're educated in it and how aware we are of these threats. I think, for me, if I get a direct message on Instagram that I don't like, I delete it, I block the person and move on. But I'm not sure my grandparents know to do that. And so, it's a really interesting thing to think about, how our individual kind of place in life is going to determine our response. And in a lot of ways, we just kind of ignore that this is an attempted crime. This is something that is happening so often.
I love it. I know I'm a sucker for good apples to oranges comparison, but like if someone attempted to murder me, I would certainly make the police aware of that, right? If someone attempts to steal my identity, it's almost like we have this societal expectation to just shrug it off or just say like, well, did you click the email link? No? Okay, then why are we talking about it, right? I don't know if that's necessarily fair from the perspective of someone whose research centers on crime victims, right? Is putting it strikes me almost as victim blaming to a certain extent of saying this expectation should fall on you to keep yourself safe in this one crime type, but not necessarily other crime types. And the way, sort of the discourse that I see when we talk about fraud victims and identity theft victims, when we talk about their experiences, their narratives, what happened to them, it really does remind me of some of the same victim blaming narratives that we're seeing coming out of the sexual victimization literature, right? If we're talking about research that looks at sexual assault, rape, sexual harassment, all these sorts of gender-based forms of victimization, we often hear this narrative of like, well, why did you go out dressed like that? Why were you drinking that? Why were you going out drinking alone, right? And we know that these are unacceptable forms of victim blaming. We all acknowledge that to say that to someone is inappropriate. But then why do we still criticize someone for clicking on a link from a Nigerian prince? Why do we similarly criticize someone for clicking on that phishing email thinking they had an Amazon package coming, right? Isn't it the same sort of type of putting the blame onto the victim? And if we know that that has such negative consequences for victims of sexual violence, right? Victim blame undermines reporting. It stigmatizes victims. So it can be a re-traumatizing experience trying to even come forward to police who don't necessarily believe you when these victim blaming narratives are so present and so strong. We have to expect those same types of things are going to happen to fraud victims, right? And I think that that's a huge deal because if fraud is so common and so consequential, it's not just financial losses. Folks are going to be getting victimized frequently, more and more frequently, losing more money, and talking to less people about it. How are we ever going to really appraise our risk and be able to identify, hey, I'm safe. I feel safe talking to my family, talking to my friends about this. If I'm still being stigmatized for clicking on a link from Nigerian prince, right?
I think as we kind of societally and in the scholarship learn more about things like sexual assault, right, and how prevalent they actually are in comparison to how often people are reporting because of things like that, the impetus was to become better informed on response options for things like sexual violence and domestic violence, right? I don't think we're seeing necessarily the same response for forms of cybercrime that have similar, reactions, even though they are staggeringly common. We're still seeing, I won't name who it is out of the group, but there's a reviewer in the mix on one of our papers who came back with a comment about saying that local police need to be trained to respond to cybercrime by saying you're conflating responsibility of local police and federal police. Cybercrime is a federal issue. It fundamentally is not anymore, but we're still seeing this kind of persistent, attitude towards that.
And I think that this view of cybercrime is this sort of ephemeral thing that doesn't necessarily happen in my physical space where I'm at. It's always the offender could be overseas. The offender could be in a different part of the world. And I think that that knee-jerk reaction to sort of dismiss this crime as unsolvable for a local police department, it almost seems like a bit of a learned helplessness to me. I think that a lot of these crimes, you're right, this is an issue for local police. This is an issue for everyone. And being able to acknowledge that, yeah, this is happening everywhere in my space, especially as post-COVID with everything moving online, education, commerce, socialization, romance, everything is online now. Are these really things that are happening in these faraway places that are completely unsolvable for local police? Or is it time that we start reappraising what kind of responsibilities and expectations we have for law enforcement in terms of helping victims?
So we talked a lot about law enforcement so far. How do you think things like the disparity of reporting comes in here too? So I'm just thinking you could go to the FTC, you could go to the IC3, you could contact your state attorney general for assistance with identity theft recovery. There's all these different avenues that we have for reporting. Do you think that adds to the confusion, or what's the role of so many different reporting tools in victim confusion?
That's such a great question. I think that when I think about cybercrime, my first thing I always want to do is look for an offline parallel. And you're right, if we're talking about cybercrime compared to an offline crime, like let's say homicide, let's just keep it simple. It's very simple and very obvious who you report a murder to, right? If you are unfortunate enough to come into a circumstance where you're obliged to report that, you dial 911 and you tell them what happened, and then someone shows up, and it's pretty straightforward in terms of the process. But with cybercrime, you're right, there are so many different agencies. So you have the Internet Crime Internet Crime Complaint Center, right? The FBI's reporting base. We have the Better Business Bureau. If you have a business-related fraud, you have the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. You could file a report to police. You could file a report to federal police. You could file a report anywhere. And I think having this plurality of options can be a bit intimidating. I know that's certainly how I feel, right? Which is the best agency? Should I file one report twice, or is that going to generate like bad crime data where one crime counts as 7 reports because I've reported to every possible agency? What are some of the implications of me reporting this to different agencies? How's it going to get counted? Who's going to actually respond, depending on where I report it to who and how, right? I think that it can be daunting from the perspective of a victim to think about these things. I think that having a bit more streamlined process is definitely a path forward that everyone in this space is looking for, right?
I think too, on that note, like I think about the experience of emergency services. A lot of times they don't treat non-violent crimes the same way, right? They'll say, okay, we'll take a report and we'll send an officer to you when we can. Or, oh, well, that's an investigator's role. We're going to, we'll have to set up an interview for you. It's not an immediate response, right? And so when we're thinking about murder, robbery, all those things, it's the emergent factor, right, that gets that immediate response. But we don't consider the fact that people could be draining my bank account right now, right? And we don't think about that. And I think 911 responders aren't necessarily trained to think that way because they have to focus on the emergencies. And yet I know if I have a problem with police, but it's not violence or, an immediate need, I think, do I call 911? Do I call a non-emergency number? What do I do? And so even knowing the amount of options that are there, you think, well, I'm not sure I'm going to get the response I want. And so I can only imagine being in that moment of, I don't know who to call. I know that 911 is maybe not the correct answer, even if it may be the correct answer, but I'm feeling in that moment that I'm not going to get a response either way. And so I think we have to find better ways. Maybe it's specific lines, kind of like the, what's the 811?
Oh, the non-emergency line?
Is that okay? I don't know. I never knew if that was like a national standard or if it was just in certain states, but like,
Ohio.
yeah, I don't know.
It's 311 here.
Maybe it's 311. Okay. I got confused when I said it with the line that you called to look up gas lines before you dig things.
Oh, here you call Mystic, I think.
That's what I was like, Taylor, don't go down this path. That's wrong. But, I just think like we can bring these sort of avenues to people in a way that is more meaningful. And I think one thing that really fascinates me about your research is how you're reaching those populations that aren't getting this education, right? They're not getting it in traditional ways. They maybe aren't socialized the same way online. So if you could speak to some of that work, I'd be really interested to hear what you're working on.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. One of the big things that I've been trying to build over the last couple of years is a body of research looking at sort of expanding understandings of who's actually at risk of these forms of victimization, things like identity theft, things like fraud, and understanding sort of the causal mechanisms at play. If we can ever speak to that, it's always very tentative, right? But still sort of just trying to clarify what's happening bit by bit. What can we understand as increasing people's risk of these forms of victimization? So I've been lucky enough to do some research looking at a lot of different, you could say, specialized populations or specialized communities that might be facing different risk relative to the general U.S. population, right? For instance, I just did a recent study with Tom, actually. We did a study looking at veterans and military service members as a group potentially disproportionately at risk of both data breach victimization and subsequent identity theft, because we know that data breaches and identity theft are often pretty closely tied, right? It's often my data is compromised through a breach and then subsequently misused, which is the identity theft component, right? Someone actually takes my breached credit card number and buys something with it, or takes my breached social security and misuses it somewhere. And we had some really interesting findings. We looked at data from the National Crime Victimization Survey Identity Theft Supplement, which is, again, a very huge national representative survey looking at these types of victimization. And one of our findings was that veterans and military service members were at greater risk relative to non-veterans, non-service members, right, of both identity theft and data breach victimization. And again, I like to situate a lot of these things in my own experience whenever I can and whenever it's appropriate to, research-wise, of course. And I just think about a lot of my own experiences coming from that background and that space where when you're in the military, you often find yourself having to share sensitive information, right? What's your social? Everyone in this platoon has to tell me their social security numbers so that we can get everyone processed for X, Y, and Z. Everyone in this squadron has to give us their blood type, date of birth, social security number for this other task. And where there's such a candidness about sharing personal information and such an ease with doing so that I think that these findings might have reflected a perhaps lack of security mindfulness, or perhaps there was something else, right? We can never speak to fully what was happening and why, but it's just interesting to think about, because a lot of the time when I think about identity theft prevention programming, usually the only thing I see is programming that says, aging and elderly populations. Let's stop identity theft among aging and elderly populations. They're the most at risk, which, sure, the research does suggest that folks who are in these upper age strata tend to face greater risk relative to younger folks of identity theft. But it's important to me to also kind of caveat that with a little asterisk and say, like, they're at risk, yes. But also, so are these other groups, right? So are veterans and military service members for different reasons. And it's potentially important to understand those different reasons so we can sort of disrupt that process in unique ways for different subpopulations, right? I just did another study with some colleagues from Cincinnati, and we looked at different forms of disability, disaggregated disability status types as potential risk factors for identity theft, again. And not just risk factors, but also consequences of victimization. And one of the really key findings that really struck me was that folks who had cognitive disabilities, which was, again, sort of based on the NCVS identity theft supplement's definition of cognitive disabilities, faced a significantly greater risk of being victims of identity theft relative to folks without cognitive disabilities. And that's really striking to me because, again, we often frame the narrative of almost exclusively on let's help aging and elderly populations. And again, yes, and we can help aging and elderly populations and all these other groups who also face greater risk, right? I think that it's important to reach these other specialized communities and populations that might not otherwise get the same attention in terms of risk prevention, risk management, and understanding how these things manifest. Because if we fail to really talk about these groups and acknowledge how risk manifests for folks with disabilities, military service members, other different groups, it's going to be really hard to ever build sort of an evidence-based program to sort of disrupt that risk, right? So that's really what I've been interested in lately, and it's really great to get a chance to talk about it. So.
I think one of the fascinating parts of this issue, too, is that identity theft is something, yes, you can play a hand in when you're responding to a fraudulent email or a phishing scheme or something like that. But there's also the dilemma where it's completely out of our hands when it's a data breach or a third-party entity. And so when you're controlling for factors like, say, a disability or a military service, how is that factor of security out of your control where a corporation or an entity is targeted? What can we do to better understand that as a function of risk for identity crimes?
Well, if I think about data breaches, I like to think about what individuals' unique identities and their own unique intersectionalities might say about where they're sharing information and what organizations might subsequently breach. So, for instance, I mentioned I'm a veteran. I was a military service member, early 2010s. Implicitly, you can assume that the Veterans Affairs Administration has my data, right? That's part of the process, right? They've got my info. And if we look at organizations that are uniquely susceptible to risk of data breach victimization, organizations like that are at greater risk. I mean, let's shift the conversation to disabilities as well. What are some organizations that are more likely to have the information of folks with disabilities? So let's focus on cognitive disabilities specifically. Who's going to be more likely to have that information, right? Medical institutions, these organizations that offer professional service and care, organizations that might in themselves be susceptible to breach victimization, getting that data breach, right? And you're right, it is totally out of my hands whether or not my data is breached, but it's not out of my hands to be aware of how my intersectionality can inform that risk so that I can be attentive to that, right? If my information is shared with organizations that are potentially going to be breached, that might tell me as an individual, hey, you need to be more cognizant of your credit score. You need to be more cognizant of checking your credit history, checking how many cards are in your name, checking any lines of credit that you have, because there's a potential for misuse that's out of your hands, unfortunately. So while that is a sort of an unfortunate reality, it definitely, I think, puts the power back in the victim's hands to sort of reclaim that safety and say, yeah, the VA or this hospital or whatever agency it is, doesn't really matter. This agency might have been breached, but I'm still gonna do my best to not let that affect me downstream in terms of actual identity theft.
I know the way I like to think about it is because I always thought about how like volume of information aligns with opportunity, right? So more people that have my information, the more likely I am to fall into a breach or whatever. And I think about it like if I had 100 gold coins and I wanted to protect them, I could choose between 6 or 7 different storage facilities. One may have a fence, one may have a gate with a code, one may have locked doors, right? And I can think about it in terms of, okay, where do I feel the safest? But when it comes to our information, we don't always have that choice, right? It's I have to trust the federal government with my information. They have to have it. I have to trust MSU as my employer. We don't have that autonomy in it. And so while I may be a risk averse person and want to keep all my gold coins in my home, in my safe, I don't have that option with my information. And so to think about not only in today's world how many people have access to our information by necessity, but then also by us volunteering it. But then you add on the fact that these populations are people that may not have the best socialization in online platforms or may not have ever been taken seriously and educated properly in those situations, right? We tend to think, I know this has come up in our law enforcement training, of individuals that are involved in romance fraud, right? They don't always really understand that this is not real love, right? They've been convinced that it is. And so to think about those kind of contexts on top of the fact that we really don't have a ton of autonomy. Now there is some, right? I can choose what social media platforms to be on, but so much of that information access is outside of our hands. We just have to trust these groups. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't trust a lot of them.
And one thing you said I really want to latch onto there is this idea that some people are not necessarily socialized or trained to think about this in a certain type of way. And I go back to folks with disabilities, right? Especially if we're talking folks with cognitive disabilities. This is a group that's often given a very paternalistic treatment in our society, and often a very very hands-on approach, a very heavy hand in terms of what information you have access to and how you have access to use it, right? Especially if we talk about, I've been doing a lot of research with folks from the University of Cincinnati in the space of disability and vulnerability and reporting. And one of the things that we keep coming back to in our findings is that I should preface also, our research focuses on gender-based victimization. But one of the things that we keep coming back to with this research is folks with disabilities, especially cognitive disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, they're often left out of conversations with respect to sexual and reproductive health, right? There's often this treatment of folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities as almost asexual, which we know that's not accurate. We know that's a bit inappropriate, right? Hormones are still there. Hormones are still happening, right? And these same folks are often left out of conversations of how to engage in healthy romantic relationships, right? There's often this view from parents, family members, caretakers that this isn't something you're going to have to worry about. As inappropriate as that may be, that's sort of the reality that we're seeing in our research. And just thinking back to romance fraud, just sort of that confluence of not only having been at the table for conversations about sexual and reproductive health, but also healthier relationships. And also not being at the not being at the table for conversations about technology usage, right? Folks with disabilities don't necessarily get the same access and exposure to tech as their peers without cognitive disabilities. So this is like it's like this confluence, it's like this perfect storm for romance fraud, catfishing, all these types of crimes, especially in the intellectual and developmental disability, cognitive disability community. And it's terrible to see, but it's something that's been really driving me in my research agenda over the last couple of years to sort of shed some more light in that space and sort of say, like, look, this is happening. Let's pay attention, people.
I think it's really interesting, and I'm not a parent. I'll convert Tom on being the parent over here. But, I think about having those conversations with your kids is already hard enough, right? Nobody wants to have the sex talk with their kids. That's not something that people feel generally good or positive about. And so to think that they already have this predisposition that my child facing these certain disabilities, it's not going to be an issue for them. I'm not even going to broach the subject. I'm not going to bring it up. I'm going to hope they never think about it, right? And so then you add on the fact that a lot of the older generations, and again, no offense, Tom, but you're the parent. You're the parent. I mean, okay, okay, JJ.
We're talking about identity theft.
No, it has to stay in. Leave it in, leave it in.
My bad. That came out poorly. But to my point, right, Tom, I was going to give you a compliment, actually. I was going to say, Tom does study this stuff and does know these things.
Despite
And
his age?
yeah, despite his age, he actually knows how to use a computer.
This is the second time in 2 days back to back that we've both kind of indirectly or directly called him all.
Hey, as a 70-year-old, I really don't appreciate this.
Great parent.
Whew, okay, let me bring it back here. Okay, I don't even know how to rein this back in here. We've had discussions before about how you and your wife take these conversations very seriously with your kids, right? You're very aware of the platforms that your kids are on, right? But there's a lot of parents out there that aren't, right? I really was going to compliment you, I promise. But, there's a lot of people out there, and I think about my parents, if they had to have a sex talk with me on top of talking about romance, fraud, and online environments, I would have gone very poorly, right? That would not have gone well in the early 2000s. And so, to trust that adults are responsible enough to teach the young kids that they're around, or even just keep an eye on these kids, is so hard to believe is happening regularly, I guess is my point, right? And so to think about how, kind of to your point earlier, about how hard it is to find evidence-based programming. We don't have a place to turn to. There are plenty of online resources, but you have to trust that you know where they are, they're going to be effective, and that your kid will be receptive to it. And so to think about children, especially, and people that fall into these special populations, right? They are going to require a different approach. And I'm not convinced we're good on the beginning approach, right? The first approach. We don't have good sex ed in our education system. Well, I shouldn't say everywhere. At least my experience wasn't great.
If I could interject, though,
yeah.
I think that just the very idea of sex ed needs to shift, because how are people meeting their partners back when Tom was dating?
Well, you put an ad in the radio and wait for people to respond.
Bring up a
Yes,
telegram
exactly.
and you'd say all singles available.
Would you be interested in dates? Stop. Please let me know if so. Stop.
Let's think about
Meeting at the
dating.
internet cafe.
How do people meet now? How do people meet their
Yeah.
romantic partners now? It's almost exclusively online. People don't meet at college or at the coffee shop or at church or at the bar anymore. We meet online. So I think it's become one topic. The topic has evolved. You can't just say it's not just a matter of talking about safe sex. It's a matter of talking about safe intimacy. And for better or for worse, intimacy occurs online now.
Yeah.
That's the reality that we're facing is our 21st century society, our post-COVID world, right? So I think that we have to embrace that, especially because if we think about folks in emerging adulthood who are on the cusp of having to really think about this and worry about this, their peers are going to be socializing them whether the parents are doing it or not.
Yes.
So it's important to acknowledge that your kid's going to get this information. You should probably have a better hand in it in terms of what they're getting, because if you don't, it's going to be the Wild West, right?
Well, and as you were saying, especially with disabled folks, there are a lot of layers present there. And I think a lot about perceptions, right? Perceptions of victimization and how that influences responses. But I think that the work that you're doing is so important in fighting an uphill battle against viewing the disabled community as a monolith in terms of independence, right? The degree of, oversight that disabled adults require or don't require. But even in the context of when someone doesn't necessarily live independently and has either a caretaker, whether that's a parent or another individual, does that mean that, they are not subject to even financial victimization? How do we constitute harm when we think about non-physical forms of victimization, right? And I think it's easy for people to say, well, if you're disabled, then you're likely shielded from it anyway. So why would you need to know? And again, that's using disabled incorrectly and very broadly in saying that.
No, but I think you have some really good points, though. And if we look at some of the statistics in terms of victimization among the disability community, one of the biggest trends that we see is perpetrators are rarely strangers. Perpetrators are usually known or acquainted with the victim in some regard, whether that's as family members, caretakers, just friends or acquaintances, right? It's usually someone who is known to the victim. And that's really meaningful because it's a different dynamic than you might see in other contexts, other populations. And I think it's important to have tailored supports that actually reflect the reality that folks are living. And it's great to have a policy that says, let's help folks with disabilities not be victims. But it's another thing entirely to have an evidence-based policy that actually embraces the reality of how this victimization manifests, right? Understanding who is doing it, when it's happening, where it's happening, how it's happening, what sort of consequences are unique to the disability community that they're facing relative to other populations, and how can we actually do something about it, right?
So I'm going to shine a spotlight on you because I'm not sure if you would have brought this up normally, but I know you've engaged in education programs for these special populations. Can you speak a little bit about your approach to that and your experience with it? Because I think you're running that race for us, right? You're doing the thing. So
Right. Yeah. So this last fall semester, I had a really great opportunity to work with the Transitions and Access Pathways program, TAP program, as they call it, out of the University of Cincinnati. This is a program that's meant for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities to sort of offer independent living skills that sort of get folks ready for that next phase of life, right? That post-college life. What's next? This era of emerging adulthood. And one of the things that they actually asked me to talk about was they become aware of my research through a mutual colleague. And they reached out to me and said, hey, we have a lot of students who are having issues with, romance fraud, folks who are potentially experiencing this or having really close calls, and we want to do something about it, but we just don't really know what to say. So I was actually lucky enough to teach the TAP class students this previous semester. It was a really fun experience, and it was a really different experience for me teaching because I did a lot of changes in how I presented my material. I tried to be very thoughtful in terms of what I presented and how, and one of the biggest things was sort of prioritizing plain language, right, and universal design and how materials are presented, right? It's one thing for an academic egghead to be talking about correlations and statistically significant associations and multivariate relationships, but that doesn't necessarily translate in a meaningful way to the populations who are living it, right? And one of the biggest things that I had to do that I found really rewarding is taking all of my course materials, right, all my slides, all my handouts, everything, and translating it into this very accessible, very plain language document. And I know we tend to view accessibility as sort of this afterthought or something that we tend to roll our eyes at, like, oh, great, I have to do this. But it's really rewarding to see it actually have this impact of like, no, this is meaningful, and this actually has substantive, helpful impacts on people's lives. And sometimes it's a matter of, I can't even understand what you're saying, and the breakdown of the process is immediate. So it's really nice to be able to overcome that. And being able to see the light bulbs within, the students' eyes as I was talking about romance fraud, how it happens and why it happens, and what you can do to detect it. It was just so fun, and it was such a rewarding experience.
So what came to my mind when we were talking about that is at our last law enforcement training, we had an officer come up to us afterwards and ask for help on handling a situation where the individual didn't want help, right? They were supposedly in love with this person. The family knew that it was a scam. The officer knew it was a scam, but the person themselves was so convinced that they were having a hard time getting resources to them and convincing them to.
And had told this officer that their next step was to get power of attorney.
Yes.
So they were at the extent to where they were hitting the big red button because they couldn't figure out how to get to the person.
Right. Yeah. And so what this brought up for us at that moment, and I think ties in nicely here, is that idea of the responsible adult in the room. I know overseas there are systems in place where they will have responsible adults that do interrogations with individuals who have disabilities, or like we have special advocates for children. But it makes me think about the way that we approach the conversation can't be that angry, upset, victim blaming we talked in the beginning, because that simply won't resonate with them, right? They aren't going to understand that their behavior precipitated because they see it as a positive thing, right? I'm in love. This is great. I'm going to meet the person I'm going to be with forever.
To me, we have to go back to what fraud is. And fraud is a crime that's characterized by the use of deception.
Yes.
And I think that's sort of what underpins all of it, right? Fraud is deception. It's not a crime that's perpetrated by violence or threat or force. This is someone lying to you. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes our victims have not seen the deception yet in the same way that maybe friends or family members or police might, because we're trained to think about it that way. Or we've seen it on TV and we're like, oh, this is such an open and shut case of romance fraud. Why are you buying it? Because this person's being deceived. They simply don't know yet. And it's a matter of not just saying, hey, you're dumb for falling for this, but it's a matter of sort of illustrating to people, hey, here's what's happening. This is another very similar case. This is someone who's using the same profile pictures as your partner, right? This is what's happening, and sort of illustrating and proving to them that it's a fraud rather than telling them. I think it's one of the biggest things, regardless of disability status, regardless of whether we're talking about special populations or not. I think that just whole cloth more generally, we have to acknowledge that being a fraud victim is a very delicate process, and it can be very alienating when someone comes up to you and gets in your face and says, "Hey, you idiot, why'd you fall for this?" What do you mean, why did I fall for it? I'm in love, right? And it's on the outside looking in, you just have this terrible feeling for the victim of, oh no, you're not in love. But again, it's not a matter of telling people that, it's a matter of showing them that.
I think too in that situation, right, there's, and I know from that one experience this came up as well, but the idea of I'm almost more fearful of the response to it, right? I don't want my social media taken away. I know we talk about this with the elderly population and cars, right? There's a point in time where you got to take your parents' keys away from them, and that's a really hard thing to do because they're so used to this autonomy. And so we're trying to teach people to be autonomous and to protect yourself in these spaces, but when the response is get off social media, get out of these platforms, don't use Telegram, don't use whatever.
This goes back to me, this keeps going back to me with this idea of this, there's these really firm parallels between how we talk to, I don't want to say we, but how people talk to women in reference to sexual victimization of like, you shouldn't go out alone at night, you shouldn't go out unaccompanied, you shouldn't wear X, Y, and Z, you shouldn't go out drinking at this bar. Saying those things is inappropriate. Saying to someone, oh, just don't go online. Isn't that such a wholly inappropriate solution for our lives right now? Our entire lives are online. I can't pay rent without going on the internet.
Yeah.
I can't teach my class without going online. I am actively online as this podcast is recorded. To simply say, oh, just don't go to that bar, that's not an appropriate solution to women in reference to sexual violence. We know that. To say, oh, just don't go online, why don't we see that as something that's equally inappropriate?
Go ahead.
I think that it's thinking about romance fraud in the context of families trying to deal with it with, their older relatives. I don't think it's the only example of it, but I think that's where fraud becomes such this insidious form of crime because it's raising conversations and confrontations that people aren't prepared for, right? And it's challenging the ways that people think about, deservingness of harm or whether you've done it to yourself. And I think that all at the same time, right? Because I think that with new methods of activity, crime closely follows. Everyone is having to wrap their heads around simultaneously how much our lives are all online while also navigating the harms that are posed by that. And people are often very disbelieving when you show them, right, examples of conversations where these kinds of frauds are conducted. And people are like, how would you fall for that? That's so stupid.
People are very dismissive too in terms of, oh, I wouldn't fall for that.
Yeah.
I'm better. I wouldn't click on this because I'm no fool. Well, I think the thing that is really interesting that people need to acknowledge is there's a fraud for everybody. Like the frauds are highly unique and there's no just one approach that fraudsters are using. These are often highly tailored. One thing that I often teach about in a course here at Michigan State about frauds and scams is the idea that a lot of fraudsters for romance fraud actually look for obituaries, right? If I know someone is recently bereaved, I can assume that that person is quite lonely and also single. As a romance fraudster, that is a very good potential target. And that's just one example of how these attacks can be personalized, right? It's not like the old days where someone was sending out the same cookie cutter Nigerian prince email to 7,000 inboxes. These are very sophisticated, tailored, targeted attacks. I mean, if we look at some of the romance frauds that are coming out of, there's a lot of conversations about scam compounds in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, that area of the world. We're seeing things like romance fraud scripts, where the perpetrators have line-by-line descriptions of what to say based on how the conversation is going. It reminds me of almost like a choose-your-own-adventure book, right? Where if the victim said X, you say Y. If the victim said Y, you say Z. And these scripts work so well in terms of facilitating these frauds to the point that it's very frustrating for me as a researcher in this space when I see people criticize or antagonize victims of saying, oh, why'd you fall for that? I'm like, well, because it's a highly deceptive scam that's been very well orchestrated and developed over several years. You would have fallen for it too. You're just lucky it got to me first.
So at the risk of outing myself, while I was writing my dissertation on smishing scams, I fell for a phishing scam, right? Because it was just in my inbox. I was looking for a PDF and it had a link on it. And so to that point, right, even the most well-intentioned people are going to be deceived at some point. And I say that recognizing that, I probably should have read it a little closer, but, I learned from it. And so what we haven't brought up yet and what you just made me think of is the impact that AI is having on it, Right now, I don't even have to talk to the person. I can run a bot. Right, that bot's going to talk to them in that chat messenger, and I don't even have to worry about it because it's going to do all that thinking for me. And so you think about deception and the impact that AI is having. I'd love to get your take on where you think we're going with that.
I got to say two things, though, first of all.
For sure.
First, I really love and appreciate that you're willing to talk about having fallen for a phishing email, because I think that it's one of those things that we're all so bashful about, especially in a space where we want to be perceived as experts, right? It seems like it can almost cause a reputational harm to even admit to something like this happening. And again, that's so unfair. And that sort of, I think, is a contributing factor to why we have these stigmatizations of these types of crimes, right? It's easy for me to imagine a professor in criminal justice who researches cybercrime to say, oh, no, I would never fall for that. That's beneath me, right? I research it. I would never fall for it. But I really appreciate that you're willing to talk about it, because that's something that I think more of us need to be candid about, to acknowledge the risk and acknowledge that, no, this isn't just happening to people who don't have an education or in this group or that group, right? This is a professor, this is a doctor who is experiencing this the same as anybody else. So it's not some rare occurrence that happens to just certain people. So
Absolutely.
now I completely forgot your question.
The impact that AI has had on like the deception component of fraud. Yeah, of course.
So yeah, I think the biggest thing there is like, one of the big things that we used to think about is stereotypical phishing email, where a lot of this started. That's like the gateway, the vector for so many of these crimes is the phishing email. What did we used to look for 10, 15 years ago, right? What did we look for? Bad spelling, bad grammar. Someone that said an email that says, hello, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm a woman, so no.
Right.
Just the little weird little fishy things that were just like, they didn't quite smell right about the email. And I think that one of the dangerous parts about AI is that we've been able to smooth over a lot of those things, right? Phishing emails are so darn convincing now that it's hard to tell them apart. And I think that we need to be more candid societally about that. You're not going to be looking for grammar issues anymore. We're talking about every one of these is 10 times more polished than it used to be.
And then you add on the fact that, we haven't talked about authority, but authority plays such an important role in this, right? It's coming from my boss. They've spoofed the email. So now looking at the URL doesn't even matter, or the links that are attached to the email address, whatever it is, right? This can all be spoofed. And so, simply looking for those mistakes just doesn't work. And I think so much of the education that is built out, at least I know from what I've had to take through various courses and whatnot, it's still asking for those types of things, right? Look at the email address, see if it matches who it is. Well, of course it's going to match. They spoofed it, right? They faked it. And so, to think about all those kind of cognitive tools that we've been taught along the way, AI has just wiped all that out. And it's become so much more difficult to understand what cyber hygiene looks like in a world with AI. I know research doesn't really have the answers for that yet, but I think it's going to come down to, recently I worked with Dr. Burris and Courtney Weber at USF, and we did a paper looking at the cyber hygiene and how we can measure it in today's world. And the answer we came to was it's going to keep evolving, right? It's going to keep changing. What you consider cyber hygiene today is not going to be cyber hygiene in 6 months. And so I think the thought that we all need to get on board with is that this has to be a personality thing. You have to be risk averse in these environments and be able to learn and keep up.
And one example that's kind of a bit far afield, but I think it's still interesting. Just even thinking about what even falls under the umbrella of cyber hygiene, because I talk to students all the time about QR codes, right? Yeah. Any random QR code on a random light post it's just a link. It's just the same as clicking a random link on a random web browser. Would you do that? No, then why are you going to scan this
That's such a
QR
great
code?
point.
Right? Cyber hygiene occurs in terrestrial physical spaces. And I think that sometimes that disconnect of like, this is a physical little sticker on a light post, but this is cyber hygiene. It can get lost for people, right? Because it's not happening on my laptop. It's not the same thing that I'm used to thinking about.
Well, the lines are blurring if they ever were separate, right? And this is a theme that we recurringly and constantly return to, right? Is that it's not cyber versus meat space, if you will. Like they're distinctly intertwined at this point.
Let's not use that term anymore.
I know, I hate it so much, but I gotta use the terminology when you can. But I have a question that's actually going way back to when we were kind of talking about the construction and maybe progression of frauds. And I figure we can ask it as we're approaching our closing marks, where we're going to put you on the spot and ask for a single takeaway.
Uh-oh.
But I'm not going to give you time to think because I'm going to ask you this first. So you mentioned the link between data breaches and identity theft as kind of a secondary outcome, and that they often, ride together.
Sure.
When thinking about data breaches, and this may be going beyond the scope of your work as a victimologist, but are there particular companies or sectors where data breaches have shown to be the most harmful, or we're seeing the most kind of identity theft come behind it?
I have to admit ignorance here. I'm not necessarily familiar with any specific organizational data breaches that have been more problematic at the individual victim level, but it's often been something that I think about, especially as we look at data breaches. It seems like everyone sets a new record. I don't know if y'all are seeing this.
Yeah.
It's like, this one's 3 billion. Oh, well, this one's 3.5 billion. Oh, well, this next one's 4 billion records leaked. And it gets to the point where it's like, oh my God, how big are these going to get?
Yeah.
And it's one thing that I've been wondering, I'm curious what y'all's thoughts are on this actually, is if there's almost an inverse relationship between the size of the data breach and any individual person's risk of consequences attendant to that breach, right? Because if my data is part of a data breach of only 10 people, I have a 1 in 10 chance of my record potentially being misused. But if my data breach is one of a 4.5 billion person record breach, it seems like I'm a bit more of a needle in a haystack, right? So I'm wondering if, as the folks who are perpetrating these data breaches are getting better and more sophisticated at pulling millions and millions of records, how that influences risk at the individual level downstream. That's something I haven't really seen a lot of research on, and something that, frankly, I would love to sort of dive into in the next couple of years.
Yeah. I think before the influx of AI, it would have been a really interesting conversation about how target suitability is assessed. So what makes someone out of a 4.5 million observation data set the most, attractive target to go for? What makes it seem like they might respond or have the money to do so? Right. But now you can just automate 4.5 million, right? Like brute force password attempts.
Yeah.
So all that to say, I don't know.
I think I had two thoughts. One is, I think there's always going to be an emphasis on attacking critical infrastructure, and I don't know if that necessarily equates to any individual changes, but certainly an idea that we rely on certain systems and that going after people involved in those systems are inevitably going to undermine them. I think that is kind of one area that I tend to focus on, is how are these attacks affecting our critical infrastructure, and how do we as individuals make up that infrastructure? But then the other thought I had is that, when we're thinking about data breaches, I think of them secondary to ransomware in a lot of ways, right? And so I think that whether the data breach is meant to simply steal data and put it online, sell it, or breaching it in order to pull a ransomware attack, very different meanings, right? If I'm doing ransomware, I'm going to go after the most sensitive data, right? The hospital, the Stryker attack that just happened, right? I'm going to go after the impact that I know these individuals need this information right now. It's medical necessity, right? And so if ransomware is involved, I think we almost see that influence in a more concentrated aspect, right? Of like, I need to target these people because it means I will get the ransom quicker or faster or whatever, right? And so Again, I don't know of any research that's really looked at that specific question, but that's what comes to mind for me.
We've been doing some of that work out of Australia, and it does seem to matter. Some of the individual points that you raised are important. So we found that individuals with lower incomes or different factors, the data that was lost, all of those things matter in terms of identity theft experiences or secondary phishing experiences. So it is plausible that even in a huge breach, you're still at risk. I don't know whether it's driven by AI or what factors in particular. We're still kind of sorting that out. But it's definitely an area we need a lot more work in, especially that secondary targeting factor. Because if you've got that much information, sure, you could try to economically sell it, but what if we also used it for additional phishing attacks or something else? So I think there's a lot of different factors, and we need a lot more research.
That's the thought I keep having every time. It seems like every day in the office, I always just, oh God, we need more research on X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Is it gonna do it? I don't know.
All right. Well, that brings us to the point in time where we have to ask, if you could disseminate all this content into one takeaway for our listeners, what do you want our listeners to take away from today's conversation?
Risk of identity theft and fraud isn't as black and white as we have historically thought it to be, and it's really important that we appreciate the nuances and the individual characteristics that put different people, different communities at risk. And it's time that we start developing tailored policies beyond those for only aging and elderly populations, and start thinking about other groups that are also, disproportionately facing these types of crime.
Excellent.
Very good.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah, that hits the nail right on the head.
Yeah. So
Well, it was great to have you on. This was a really, really spirited conversation. This is like the most dialogue I think we've had in one of these in a while. So it was good to have you on. And we'd love to have you back to talk about your work anytime. So,
Thanks for having me.
yeah, no problem. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And we look forward to having you with us the next time we cross the firewall. Thanks for listening to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is a production of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, produced by J.J. Thomas. The thoughts and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the university. If you have a comment or a question about the show, please email us at crossingthefirewall@gmail.com. Also, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for more information. And if you're enjoying us on your favorite podcast app, please make sure that you like the show and leave us a review so that way everybody knows what we're up to. And if you're listening in on YouTube, make sure that you like us and subscribe so that way you're staying up to date on everything that is crossing the firewall.